March of the Living, which is an international organization. We were in Berlin. We're starting. Actually, I was in Halle, where I was born, among other places.
I never like to start speaking when I can't quite tell the talented musicians are about to do something else and I rudely interrupt them. So this is my cue to myself. And my cue to you. And I just want to say a huge thank you for that. To be welcomed into a room with such beautiful music is a real honour and a real treat. So thank you very much. Good evening, everybody that's in the room, and I know there's a couple of hundred people watching from home. So if you see cameras up in the room, there are people live streaming in who are at home. Such is the nature of this period that we are in, that sometimes there are more people in the room and fewer people at home. Sometimes there are fewer people in the room and more people at home. Apologies in advance. There are some people running late. We know there are a lot more people that have booked, so we will try and very quietly settle them in their seats. We will try and keep things as quiet as we can this evening, so you could help, if you could please, by turning off your mobile phones or turning them on to silent. If you haven't done so already, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So my name is Raymond Simonson. It's my privilege to be the CEO of JW3. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening as we commemorate the anniversary of one of the most devastating pogroms in modern Jewish history. And that's what it was, a pogrom. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On this very night, 83 years ago, the 9th of November, 1938, Nazi fury broke out against the Jews throughout Germany and Austria. It was the most ominous sign of what was to come. 92 Jewish people were killed that evening. A further 30,000 or more were seized and sent to concentration camps. 7,500 Jewish businesses were set on fire and destroyed. 267 synagogues were burnt down. Thousands of Torah scrolls, Judaism's most sacred objects, were desecrated and thrown onto the flames. Suddenly, it became clear that the Nazis were intent not only on killing Jews, they sought to kill Judaism itself. And they failed. The Jewish people, tiny in number, vulnerable even to this day in so many countries around the world, the Jewish people still survives and thrives and prays in our synagogues and learns in our schools and creates community that celebrates Jewish life in community centres such as this one that you are in or beaming into this evening. Here at JW3, we will never forget those who died in the Shoah, the Nazi Holocaust, and we will never stop being who we are and living our Jewish lives with pride and celebrating our Jewish culture and heritage. So it's my honour to welcome you all here this evening, whether in person or virtually, for a very special commemoration of Kristallnacht. Thank you very much to our partners, Genesis Philanthropy Group, for enabling us to make this event happen. Now, we were all welcomed into such beautiful music from the Echia Quartet. They are currently Chamber Music Fellows at the Royal College of Music, artists for the Kirkman Concert Society and City Music Foundation, and yeomen of the Worshipful Company of Musicians, and as we now know them, incredibly talented musicians. We look forward to hearing you play a special piece of music later on this evening. So now what I would like to do is to introduce our host for this evening, the wonderful John Silverman, returning to JW3. John, as many of you know, is a research professor of media and criminal justice at the University of Bedfordshire. Most of us know him, especially from his career before he turned to academia, as a journalist for the BBC, including 13 years as Home and Legal Affairs correspondent. We know he won the Sony Radio Journalist of the Year award for his coverage of the UK's war crimes investigations, which is the subject of his next book, and hopefully we'll bring him back to JW3 when that book comes up. Please welcome John Silverman.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And I do want to assure people, both here and watching online, that I am here in person. I'm not a hologram. It's a great privilege to be asked to compare this event. And just before we hear from Yves Kugler, who was actually in Germany at the time of Kristallnacht as a child, I just want to offer a very brief reflection on the historical significance of the event and its resonance for today's troubled world, because there are some very eerie parallels. As we sit here tonight, thousands of migrants are being used as a kind of political football on the border between Belarus and Poland. And of course, the prelude to Kristallnacht was the decision by the Nazi regime to expel the Polish Jews from Germany and force them back over the border with Poland. And they too were trapped in a kind of no man's land in human conditions as winter approached, rather like today's refugees are. And amongst their number was a young man, a teenager called Herschel Grinspan. His parents and family were amongst that number. He was actually in Paris at the time, and as a kind of act of frustrated protest, he shot and killed a German diplomat in Paris. And that was the pretext that the Nazis used for launching the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. And it's interesting to me that given how slowly politicians and policymakers tend to respond to developing crises, the response of the British government at that time was remarkably swift. And that was a government that has rightly been criticised for its inaction during the 1930s in the face of the growing Nazi menace. And the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, certainly no Philo-Semite. If any of you have ever read any of his personal diaries, you can see he didn't like Jews. He admitted he didn't trust Jews. But he was palpably shocked by the reports that he was receiving from diplomats and others in Germany on the 9th and 10th of November. And within 6 days, he'd agreed to meet a delegation of faith leaders, not only Jewish ones, but particularly Quakers, who were very prominent at the time, to urge the government to take some decisive action to protect the Jews of Germany. And the following day, the cabinet met to discuss the Jewish problem. And 5 days later, the House of Commons convened and approved a motion to an initiative, to set up an initiative which today we know and celebrate as the Kindertransport. So just think about it. Only 12 days elapsed between Kristallnacht on the 9th and the 21st when the Kindertransport initiative was set in motion. So I think, it's a quite extraordinary sort of comment on what otherwise was a pretty bleak period for policy in this country. And the Kindertransport, of course, helped save the lives of up to 10,000 mainly Jewish children. So it's my pleasure now to ask Yves Kugler to come up to the stage here so that I can quiz you.
Thank you.
And in normal circumstances, I'm sitting here, I would be expected to ask you, what are your memories of Kristallnacht? But your memories of Kristallnacht, in a sense, are recovered memories, aren't they? Because you kind of buried them, and it was only much later on into adulthood, when
Yes.
you were beginning to write a book with your mother, that they began to come to the fore again. So perhaps you can just talk about that experience of recovering those memories.
The important thing to know is that this loss of memory, partial memory of most of what happened in Germany and a little bit of what happened afterwards during the war, this is not a matter of choice. It's not something that one chooses to do. It just happens. And I'm not really sure at what point I realized that I couldn't remember things anymore. I must have been maybe in my teens, perhaps, when I started thinking about it. I don't really know. But it wasn't a matter of choice. It just happened. And my guess is that it happened because of the trauma that I experienced living under the Nazis, and particularly what happened on Kristallnacht when, as you have heard, my family experienced our home being broken into. My father was arrested and taken to a concentration camp. The business was destroyed. And it was really probably too much for an 8-year-old child to cope with. It's my guess on what happened. It's about the best I could.
And I think you were telling me that even after that, when you managed to get to France, so you were up to about the age of 11, before you went to the United States, and Eve wrote a book about this called Shattered Crystals, so anybody who wants to know the fine detail of her life story would be well advised to read that. But you couldn't remember even that period between leaving Germany and arriving in the United States.
I did remember a fair amount of what happened when we were in France, where I mostly lived in homes for Jewish children. And the interesting thing of what I don't remember is the traveling by ship. We happened to leave from Portugal, being on a ship for 2 weeks and traveling on the sea and arriving in New York City when I was almost 11 years old. Imagine not having a memory of something like that. And I think it must be the final separation of my family that I found very difficult to cope with.
I mentioned in my introduction the Polish Jews that were expelled from Germany. Now, some members of your family were amongst those Jews. What happened to them?
Among the people who were arrested and sent back to Poland was particularly my paternal grandfather, and also a number of other relatives. Most of them were told, go back where you came from, and generally people went back to the cities where they had been. However, after about 3 days, perhaps, one of my aunts, my father's sister, explained that the Poles closed the border. They did not want any more people to come in. I don't know whether it was because they were Jewish. The idea of where are these thousands of people suddenly coming into Poland? How are we going to cope for them? And they closed the border. Also, with my aunt was her 20-year-old daughter, who said, I never want to set foot on Germany again. And she managed to run across. But my Aunt Fanny came back to Germany, and as did some number of other people.
They came back to Germany at that time or after the war?
No. The arrest was at the end of October 1938. And by the beginning of November, the Poles said no more.
Right.
And so my aunt particularly, and some other people I have heard of, came back to Germany. My aunt came back to her home
And what happened to her?
Eventually, she was arrested by the Nazis about 1940, I think, and she was deported and murdered.
Talking of returning to Germany, you were you grew up in the city of Halle.
Yes.
Which is in the eastern part of Germany, in Saxony. Halle became fairly infamous quite recently, only 3 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago on Yom
when a
Kippur.
neo-Nazi tried to break into the synagogue and did kill some people outside. But you went back to Halle only a fortnight ago, is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
I think what I would like to say is that when I heard about the attack on the synagogue, I felt it very personally. I thought that, I said, it's happening all over again. I had this, I have to tell you, this feeling that it was an attack. I have to tell you that my grandfather, who came from Poland in the 1890s, built a synagogue that we all attended, and that synagogue was burnt down on Kristallnacht, destroyed. And the attack on the synagogue seemed to me to be a repetition of that act. I had the opportunity to go back to the synagogue during my visit to Halle just several weeks ago, and we were warmly welcomed by the people there.
I think it's interesting also that, I mean, some Jews at that time probably thought it can't get any worse. We know that the Germans are trying to deprive us of our jobs and our livelihood and maybe our citizenship, but they won't kill us. Your father seemed to have realized quite early on what was happening and wanted to leave Germany, is that right?
Yes, he applied for a visa to go to Palestine, as it then was, from the Jewish Agency in Berlin, and he was on a waiting list for us to go to Palestine. Unfortunately, what happened is that when our name reached the top of the list about a year after he applied, somebody, he was told, was suddenly in imminent danger of arrest, and they gave him the visa that was ours and said, nothing will happen to you, you're a businessman. And this became a pattern, so that although we wanted to leave, not stay with the Nazis anymore, we never made it out until Kristallnacht and afterwards.
When you got to the United States, did you still consider yourself a kind of German refugee? Did you think, I must integrate myself into a completely different way of life?
When I came to America, I decided that I didn't want to have anything to do with the Germans. I made an effort to learn English very quickly as a young child and to forget all my German. I just really didn't know how to speak it anymore, and I never told anybody of my experiences in Germany under the Nazis and Kristallnacht, and my experience living under the Nazis in France until I was fortunate enough to be able to leave. It was something I never talked about. Nobody knew.
And why did you never talk about it?
As a child, I think I felt that I didn't want to be different. I didn't think people would understand that who was this child? Actually, because I learned English very quickly and spoke without an accent, which one can do as a child, I just wanted to be left alone and just to get along with everybody.
You're obviously quite an inquisitive person as an adult because you became a journalist, and journalists want to know things. Yeah. Is that why you wanted to write the book with your mother and recover all those lost memories?
When I wanted to recover everything that happened, really wanted to know, because for years I thought my life began when I was almost 11. I just really had not enough before. And I wanted to know. It was important to me somehow to know about my history, my childhood. I had actually not intended to write the story, but as we met for for many, many hours with the tape recorder running, I said, this is a story that has to be told, that it was important not just for me to know, but for people to know. And so I did write the book together with her because it was the information from her and I was the writer.
But, I mean, did she resist at first? Did she want to cooperate? Would she have rather left it in the past?
My dad said, I must just mention that they survived the war in France. They were in various concentration camps, really extremely difficult time.
Yeah.
And my dad said, forget about it. But my mom said, if she wants to know, she has the right to know, and we shall tell her. And so then they all...
Did they ever talk about it at home then in the States? Or was it a closed subject for them as well?
It came up in daily life. Certain things happened, and it reminds you of, I cannot be specific. It wasn't something that they hid from us, but on the other hand, we were living in New York and trying to make our life as an American family. They were very eager to learn English, particularly because I had a younger sister who was hidden in France during the war. But here is a 10-year-old child now, and she needed to be an American child because this is where our life was going to be. And they didn't, they tried and made a reasonably successful life in America, I think.
And one of your sisters had her birthday actually on Kristallnacht, November the 9th.
Exactly.
Yes. Which is an extraordinary...
Yeah, she used to mention it. It just happened. She was born, by the way, at home because Jews weren't allowed to go to a hospital admission anymore. But we're very aware.
Oh, really?
Very aware of her birthday.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, November the 9th is also the day that the Berlin Wall came down.
Yes,
so it's a
yes,
very
said,
resonant date.
My birthday is historic.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's just one of those days.
Well, we're delighted that you've been here tonight, Eve, and I would recommend, I think your book, you say, is out of print, but I guess if enough people clamour to get it on the internet,
you can read it on the internet without charge. It's absolutely free. My mom always said, everyone has to know what happened. I invite you to Google Shattered Crystals and read the story. And thank you very much for letting me share the story.
Oh, well, thank you very much for sharing it with us. Thank you, Eve Kugler. So our second special guest tonight is Julia Gross, I think. I had trouble pronouncing it the way you like it, who is the Deputy German Ambassador to, do I say the Court of St. James?
Absolutely.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes, that's the official title. So we're very glad that you were able to join us this evening. I guess let's start, if you like, where we left off with Eve talking about the attack in Halle and the whole problem of the far right, which is a European problem. It's not a specifically German problem. What are your thoughts about the rise of neo-Nazism and this, racism, particularly as it is fueled by the social media?
I think my thoughts are characterized by deep worry and sadness to see this phenomenon. And you rightly say it's a European phenomenon. It is not only a German phenomenon, but of course, if you see things like this happening in Germany and this ugly phenomenon rearing its head again in Germany, that has a different quality than if something like that is happening in other countries. So I find this development really worrying, and I think we have to find ways to combat this. It has been exacerbated by social media, as you rightly say. And we also have a part of the political spectrum in Germany which is not immune or even includes anti-Semitic and racist theories. There's one party which has been on the rise, which is getting ever closer to extreme right positions. The AfD didn't start out as a party like that, but it is moving closer and incorporates persons who are right-wing extremists. You have to acknowledge that.
But it does seem incredible, I suppose, particularly to a Jewish audience, that in Germany, of all countries, when we thought and hoped that Nazism was dead and buried, that there are still people who both deny the Holocaust and promote overtly racist views.
Yes, I think it must seem unbelievable, and I think to the majority of Germans it is unbelievable. And I find it very painful to hear when Yves Kugler says the attack in Halle makes her feel like the same thing is happening all over again. And when I say I'm very worried about the phenomenon, I still don't believe that this will happen again. I think a majority of Germans and the German government are deeply committed to not ever let things like this happen again. I think we have institutions, we have a living democracy, and we will do our utmost to combat any recurrence of what happened under the Nazis.
But when you see what's happening in other parts of Europe, especially with the growth of populism and authoritarian leaders, now fortunately we don't have that in Germany, but would Germany be immune from that kind of nationalism?
I don't think we would claim to be immune, definitely not, because we see people who hold these opinions, we see opinions being expressed on social media of these theories, but so we wouldn't be immune, but I think we have learned, with the help of our partners after the Second World War, that we really have to build a democracy that is strong enough to fight this and to stand up against it, and we know that we have to defend our liberal values and democracy, and I think we're not only being helped by our partners within the EU, but also our other partners. We're also being watched by these partners, and I think we know that.
Now, what about Kristallnacht itself? I mean, here, as you can see, it's a solemn annual event, a commemoration. What about in Germany? Is it commemorated?
It is commemorated. There was one event today where the federal president, Steinmeier, led a commemoration. I think there were events all over Germany, mostly at a local level. So it's also a grassroots commemoration, and I think we're very aware that Kristallnacht, or the November pogroms, as we prefer to call it, because it's not just one night, it was several days of violence, which developed into something even more violent. So I think there is a real feeling that Kristallnacht or the pogroms is something that has to be remembered every year. And as Yves Kugler also said, it is a special day for Germany. Good things happened on the 9th of November, but also atrocities happened on the 9th of November. And we know that this is an integral part of German history, and we will have to remember it and keep the remembrance alive.
What about the role of survivors, if there are many survivors left, but are they invited to ceremonies like this, like Yves?
Oh yeah, they're invited, and we're very grateful that they agree to be invited and to speak to people and to share their experience. That is a very important part of remembrance, but we'll also, of course, have to find ways to keep remembrance alive for the future, and to find ways to infuse life into the history that we will demonstrate in museums or memorials or exhibitions or plays, and not to make it just a, let's say, academic remembrance, but to really infuse it with life.
I've been, as Raymond said, I'm researching a book and reading a lot of other historians writing about Germany and how it's dealt with its past. And the historian Mary Fulbrook has written, and I quote, "The Holocaust has become central to the identity and culture of Germany, incorporated into its material and moral fibre." I mean, do you agree with that? Is it so central to how Germany sees itself and its own sort of moral sense?
Yes, I think I would agree with that. It is a part of our history that we acknowledge, and we know that there's a responsibility in acknowledging that. I think we also acknowledge that we've gone a long way since the Second World War. But that doesn't, I think, create a feeling that we want to dissociate ourselves from that part of our history. There is a debate, or there has been a debate in Germany, whether one shouldn't turn a page or draw a line or put that part of our history behind us. This debate has been led in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But then you also saw a younger generation rise up and say to their parents, we're not going to have that. We're not going to accept it. This is part of our history and we have to acknowledge it. So
well, there was a particular debate amongst historians in the 80s,
Yes,
the historic right debate,
exactly.
where a number of, well, Ernst Nolte was a particular proponent of the idea that the Holocaust was not a unique event and there were other genocides or whatever that should be taken into consideration. But do you think that's just a very minority view?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there have been other genocides and you can take them into consideration, but I think it still remains a unique event in world history. And it is our responsibility. We can't talk about other people's responsibilities or atrocities that were committed in other parts of the world. This is our responsibility, and I think we accepted it. We also, I think, wanted to be seen that since then Germany has changed very much, that it is a stable democracy now. So we also want to make people see the good parts of our history, but I think that doesn't mean that we have to deny this part of our history. So I think really for a majority of people, this is something they already learn in school. It accompanies them throughout their youth, the knowledge about what happened under the Nazis, and I think it has become part of our identity.
So it's an interesting question that if the Holocaust and Germany's past is so central, is it a handicap for a country to be almost defined by its past?
I wouldn't say a handicap. It is, as I say, it is a responsibility because you can never take a political decision without thinking in this context. I wouldn't describe it as a handicap because we have learned to acknowledge the responsibility. We have drawn our lessons from it. And I think we now accept that we can also maybe not give lessons to others. We shouldn't try to do that, but share experiences. And so I wouldn't see it as a handicap, no.
Just a question about Germany must be the only country in the world which is still holding Nazi war crimes trials. And we read in the papers about a 100-year-old man and a 96-year-old woman who absconded from her home while she was on trial. But I wonder what impact they're having in society. Do people, I know you're here, but rather than in Germany, but do people read about this in the newspapers? Do parties of school children get taken to trials as they have done in the past in other countries?
I think there's a lot of media coverage about the trials. I don't know whether parties of school children are going there. We'll have to find out. I don't know. But I think they're very important to be followed, and I think there's also been a development in how these trials are being led and how they ended. With the case of John Demjanjuk, for instance, he was sentenced to a prison sentence, and I think this was unprecedented because in his case, he was given the responsibility for the deaths of thousands of people and not for one specific case that could be demonstrated he had been taking part in. So this was the first time, I think, that somebody was sentenced as a war criminal in a Nazi trial for having fulfilled a certain function in a concentration camp.
Yeah.
And that is a totally new basis on which these trials could be held. And that is why the two people that are now on trial can go to trial and might face a sentence. I mean, the lady is 96 and the other one is 100.
Yes, I mean, that's the difference between the German approach, where, as you say, the people on trial, there's no evidence that they actually killed anyone specifically, but merely by being
in the
at a concentration camp, that's sufficient. Whereas in this country, when we changed the law, there had to be very specific evidence, which is why we only ever had 2 prosecutions and 1 conviction. But that's my hobby horse I'm riding there, so that's the subject of the book. Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Julia. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I think people want to hear the German perspective on these issues. So we're very grateful for you for joining us.
And we are very grateful that people want to hear the German perspective and for being invited.
Good, thank you. And I think. So we are now going to hear some more music, I think, from the Echea quartet. And this piece of music, I think, is very, if you'd like to take your places, is very resonant. Because the composer was Victor Ullmann, and I'm sure many of you will know that Victor Ullmann was one of those creative artists that was incarcerated in Theresienstadt, and he wrote a famous opera, or at least he wrote the music for a famous opera, The Emperor of Atlantis, and sadly he died in Auschwitz in October, I think, 1944. So this piece of music is his string quartet number 3, Opus 46.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are extremely... Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are extremely moved and honoured to be here tonight to commemorate the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht. And as John was just saying, we will be performing the third and last string quartet of Victor Ullmann, who was indeed incarcerated in Theresienstadt, known as Theresien, which actually was very densely populated with lots of artists and singers and actors and playwrights. And there was a very sort of dear sense of cultural conservation in this time. The third quartet, written 1 year before he and his wife were taken and killed in Auschwitz, is in 4 movements, and each movement flows through to the next. The first is distinctly Viennese, actually, in its character, and takes on very classical models with a lilting first theme, which then gives way to a much more grotesque scherzo, which is sort of in the style of Shostakovich. There is a somewhat ironic poking fun at the regime of the time. The emotional heart of the movement is, in fact, begun with the viola fugue-like subject, which gives way to the most fervent movement, the final movement. We hope you enjoy.
Such beautiful music and so beautifully played. Thank you so much, the Chair Quartet. Thank you. And that brings... Thank you. And that brings the proceedings to an end. So our thanks to John Silverman for hosting the whole evening so very nicely. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Eve, what can I say? It's always such a joy to have you in the building, to have you back after such a long break and to hear your story tonight and how relevant and pertinent it was. Thank you. Really, again, really, really appreciate it. And Julia, thank you so much for bringing in a nice, different perspective. And thank you, especially having just come back from Glasgow yesterday rather than today, and your work there. And we wish you all the luck in your work in the future and look forward to welcoming you back to JW3. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of those of you in the room, and thank you to all of those of you at home. We look forward to seeing you at many more JW3 events, both commemorations, celebrations, lectures, comedy. We have the whole work, so please do keep an eye on our website and come along. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the evening. Thank you again.